Well, hello. Good afternoon slash evening. I am back. So, I have this week off school, so I don't have as much homework to be done. So, I'm able to kind of do a little more of this. Hello. Thanks for being here, guys. I'm going to close my door to my bedroom. It's really dark in here, but it's not my fault because it's dark outside. So, I'm going to turn this light on, see if this helps make anything brighter. Maybe. Oh yeah, that's a little better. So, it's my face for you guys. So, that's a little better. The lighting's a little better there for you. I know, it's not really dark, but it, like, storms are coming in, so it's getting all stormy out there. So, we are on book 3. This is going to be starting book 3 of the Enola Holmes Mysteries series by Nancy Springer. This is The Case of the Bizarre Bouquets. And this copy has been withdrawn from the Lorain Public Library in Lorain, Ohio. So thank you, Lorain, Ohio, for this book. Thank you for not burning it, for just giving it to someone to sell on eBay. So, thank you, Lorain, Ohio. Shout out to them today. So, without further ado, just gonna get on started. This is the prologue. March 1889. Lunatics have no common sense, thinks the matron, but then that's what deranges the faculties, sorry. That's what deranges the faculties, isn't it? Lack of common sense. Take this new inmate, now. If he had any sense, he would be exercising with the others in the airing yard on this beautiful sunny day, the first fine day of spring. He'd be following directions. Stand up straight, breathe deeply. Lift your eyes and contemplate the glories of the firmament. Now march. Left foot first. 1, 2, 3, 4. And he'd be doing himself some good. But instead, let me out, he demands for perhaps the 100th time. I am an Englishman. Such treatment of a British citizen simply cannot be tolerated. While his tone is angry, he doesn't curse. She'll give him that, even at his worst, when he fought with the keepers, when he blackened the director's eye. Even then he hadn't cursed. Nor does he now, only complaining vehemently. Let me out! I demand my rights as a loyal subject of the Queen. Let me out of this confounded coffin, I say. It's not a coffin, Mr. Kippersalt. Sitting in her comfortless wooden chair, cushioned only by her own amplitude, while in her lap she knits a sock, the matron speaks in a bored but soothing tone. The top and bottom resemble those of a coffin, perhaps, but you know quite well that a coffin would not have spindlework all up and down the sides, so you can breathe, and I can see that you are not in any difficulties. Not in any difficulties! Unexpectedly, the man lying in the confines of the restraining box starts to laugh. At the sound of his laughter, the matron drops a stitch, frowns, and lays her knitting aside, reaching for paper and pencil instead. Not any difficulties in this fiendish device, the man cries amidst naturally high-pitched yowls of laughter. You do not appear to be physically indisposed, answers the matron with gentle dignity. And you are lying on a clean pallet, and you can change your position, move your hands. Certainly the crib is preferable to a straitjacket. A crib? Is that what it's called? The man is still laughing for no good reason. The matron watches him narrowly, knowing she must take care with him. He was quite unexpectedly quick for such a stocky fellow, and resourceful, too. He very nearly made it up to the fence. In Mr. Kippersalt's barely started casebook she writes the date and time, then, patient laughing in apparent hysteria. Earlier notations state that Mr. Kippersalt most strenuously resisted putting on his gray woolen uniform while his own things were taken away for safekeeping, that he was refused food, that his urine is light and clear, he moves his bowels appropriately, and he seems to be of cleanly nature, that he shows no deformity of the head, trunk, or limbs, that he exhibits intelligence of a sort, and that he uses a handkerchief. The crib, as in cheating me of my freedom? The man's unnerving laughter is quietening. Not a bad-looking man of middle age, a soldierly type, He strokes his mustache with his fingers as if to calm himself or think. When are you going to let me out? After the doctor has looked you over. After first admitting chloral hydrate, the matron feels sure. Himself an addict to laudanum and the like, the asylum's doctor troubles himself little with the inmates other than to medicate them. Doctor? I am a doctor! The newly committed lunatic starts once again to howl with laughter. The matron writes, persists in grandiose delusions. Setting the casebook aside, she takes up her knitting again. Trying to turn the heel of a sock can be most vexing, but that's the way things are when one is married to the director of a lunatic asylum. Always 7 things to do at once, never a quiet moment to simply rest one's soul, go for a walk, or look at newspaper. The nurses require as much supervision as the patients do. Florence Nightingale's influence has not extended here, and the help is illiterate at best, if not in the grip of some vice, usually drink. The matron sighs. Trying to pick up the stitch she dropped, she cannot keep a slight edge from creeping into her voice as she replies, A doctor? That's not true, Mr. Kippersalt. Your documents of admission clearly state that you are a shopkeeper. My name is not Kippersalt. I am not the person you say I am. Why can I not make anyone at this hellish place understand that I am here because of some absurd misapprehension? Feeling the man watching her from the coffin-like box in which he lies, the matron smiles, albeit wearily. In my experience of the past 30 years, Mr. Kippersalt, patients very often believe a mistake has been made, but it has never been so. How could it be when such considerable sums of money have changed hands? Take a gentleman like you now. A number have come here declaring themselves to be Napoleon, but that's the most frequent. But we've had a Prince Albert, a Sir Walter Drake, and a William Shakespeare. I'm telling you the truth! And some of those poor distracted minds are eventually cured, the matron speaks on, ignoring the interruption, but some of them remain here yet. Is that what you want, Mr. Kippersalt, to remain here for the rest of your life? My name is not Kippersalt, it's Watson. Even through the spindles, she can see his mustache bristling. With kindly whimsy, she retorts, We have a Sherlock Holmes in one of the other wards. I wonder whether he would care to vouch for you. You are mad, I tell you. I am John Watson, medical doctor and author. All you have to do is telephone Scotland Yard. Telephone? As if anyone this far north of London City had ever seen or used such a come-lately contraption. Just call Scotland Yard? Grandiose delusions again. And ask for Inspector Lestrade. He will confirm my identity. Nonsense, the matron murmurs. Nonsense. He really thinks the director will make inquiries, give back a considerable fee, and turn him loose? The man is raving. Shush now, shh. As if trying to calm a child, she murmurs to him, concerned. Such passion might lead to brain fever if it does not soon abate. It has been 2 days now, and Mr. Kippersalt is still ranting just as irrationally as he was when they brought him in. A sad case, really. The matron has dealt with many lunatics, but she feels particularly sorry for this one, because he seems as if he might have so much good in him if he were in his right mind. It's the end of the first, or of the epilogue, or prologue, excuse me. The end of the prologue. Kippersalt. Kippersalt. Alrighty. So I think we're going to try and get through maybe 5 or 6 chapters today. So we will see. A salty kipper does sound fishy. See what you did there. Yep. Alrighty. Chapter the 1st. It is difficult to choose a new name for oneself. Even more difficult, I imagine, than choosing a name for a child, for one is confusingly intimate with oneself, whereas one is barely acquainted with a baby upon its arrival. Some artistic whim, surely, has caused Mum to name me Enola, which backwards spells alone. Do not think about Mum. Although the large bruise on my face had faded, the even larger one upon my feelings had not. Thus I remained in my lodging on the first fine sunny day in March 1889. With paper and pencil in hand, I sat at my open window. How welcome is fresh air, even the London variety, after a long winter. Looking out over the seething East End street. The scene below had attracted my attention, due to a quantity of mutton still on the hoof passing through, all manner of vehicles, including coal wagons, donkey carts, and costermongers' barrows, had locked shafts. I could hear the drivers shouting the most frightful oaths at one another. Red-coated army recruiters and other idlers looked on, grinning, while a blind beggar led by a ragged child tried to get past the jam, Street urchins climbed lampposts to stare and jeer, and women in sooty shawls hurried on their errands. They, the sorely overworked women of the slums, unlike me, had somewhere to go. Looking down at the paper in my lap, I found that I had written Enola Holmes. Hastily and heavily I crossed out this, my very own name, the one I absolutely could not use. My brothers Mycroft and Sherlock, you see, must not find me, for they quite wanted to take charge of me and transform me, via singing lessons and similar vapours, into an ornament for genteel society, which legally they could do, force me into boarding school, I mean, or into a convent, an orphanage, a young ladies' academy of porcelain painting, wherever they chose. Legally, Mycroft, the elder, could even have me locked up for life in an insane asylum. Such confinement required only the signature of 2 medical doctors, one of whom would be the mad doctor, who quite wanted money to run the place. Those and the signature of Mycroft himself, any scheme to deprive me of my freedom, I would not put beyond him. I wrote Ivy Michelle. The name I had used during the 6 months I had been a fugitive on my own. Ivy for fidelity, Michelle a play on Holmes. Holm, mess, Miss, Hole, Michelle. And I liked that name. I really wish I could keep it, but I was afraid I had discovered that Sherlock knew I used Ivy as a code name when communicating with Mum through the newspaper personal columns. What else did my oh-so-clever brother Sherlock, the one who, as opposed to the large and sessile? Sorry, they split the word up. I'll spell it for you guys. Yeah, sessile, I guess. Mycroft was actually on the hunt for me. What did Sherlock know about me? What had he learned in the course of our most irregular dealings? I wrote, he knows I look like him. He knows I climb trees. He knows I ride a bicycle. He knows I disguised myself as a widow. He knows I disguised myself as a poor woman selling pen wipers. He knows I disguised myself as a nun. He knows I gave food and blankets to the poor. He knows I carry a dagger in my corset. He knows I have located 2 missing persons. He knows I have put the police on to 2 villains. He knows I have twice invaded his Baker Street rooms. He knows I use the name Ivy. One must assume that he now knows from Dr. Watson that a young woman named Ivy Michelle worked for the world's first and only scientific Predatorian. I sighed at this last, for I quite admired Dr. Watson, although I had encountered the good physician only 3 times. The first when he had come to consult the Predatorian, a professional seeker of missing persons for the sake of his friend Sherlock Holmes. The second when I had gone to ask him a question, and he had given me a bromide for a headache. The third when I had thrust an injured lady upon his care. Dr. Watson was the epitome of a gallant, sturdy English gentleman, willing to help anyone. I liked him tremendously, almost as much as I liked my brother, for despite everything, I did adore Sherlock, although I knew him mainly through the very popular stories his friend Watson wrote about him, which I read as avidly as anyone in England. Why did those for whom I cared always seem to prove my undoing? Sighing, I pressed my lips together and drew several heavy pencil lines crossing out Ivy Michelle. What then? I was not just choosing a new name that baffled me. Or it was not just choosing a new name that baffled me. It was the all-encompassing problem of what to do and whom to be. Within what sort of woman should I next hide myself? A commoner, Mary, or Susan? How dull. Yet the flower names I loved, such as Rosemary, a symbol of remembrance, or Violet, a symbol of hidden beauty and virtue, were out of the question, for Sherlock knew about the code Mother and I used. Nor could I fall back upon one of my middle names. I had, of course, the usual gentrified quota of them, being christened Enola Eudoria Hadassah Holmes, Enola E.H. Holmes, E-E-H-H. Just the way I felt. Hadassah being my father's deceased sister's name, which Sherlock would instantly recognize, and Eudoria, even worse, being my mother's given name. Not that I cared in any way to style myself after my mother. Or did I? Curses, ye gods, I muttered naughtily, writing down Violet Vernay. Vernay being my mother's maiden name, which again Sherlock Holmes would recognize at once, but perhaps backwards. Tenrev? Well, no, but what if I played the letters a bit? Netver, never, every, ever. Ever what? Ever alone, ever forlorn, ever defiant, I told myself sternly, ever to go on being what I am. A rebel, a dreamer, and a Predatorian, finder of the lost. It occurred to me that, as a step in that direction, in order to hear news that did not reach print, I ought to try and find a position with some Fleet Street publication. Coincidentally, as I thought this, I heard my landlady's tortoise-like tread upon the stairs. "Newspapers, Miss Michelle!" she bellowed, even before she had reached the landing. Being as deaf as a turnip, Mrs. Tupper seemed to find it necessary to make a great deal of noise. As I stood up, crossed my room, and threw everything I had written into the fire, she knocked hard enough to crack walnuts. "Newspapers, Miss Michelle!" she shouted into my face just as I opened the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Tupper." She couldn't hear me, of course, but she could see my lips move in what I hoped was a smile, and I took the papers from her hands. However, she did not then go away. Instead, she straightened her short, hunched form to its limit and fixed me with her watery gaze. "Miss Michelle," she declaimed with the bravado of one who has decided to perform a moral duty, "it is no good your shutting yourself up this way. Now whatever happened, and it's none of my business, but whatever it was, it's no use getting pale about. Now it's a nice day out, with a bit of sun and starting to feel springish. Now why don't you get your bonnet on and go out for a walk, or I believe she said something of the sort. I barely heard her, and I am sorry to say I shut the door in her face, for my gaze had caught upon the Daily Telegraph's headline, and fixed there. It said, "Sherlock Holmes' associate mysteriously disappears. Dr. Watson's whereabouts unknown." And that's the end of the first chapter. E-E-H-H. Thank you. Thank you for clapping. Just gonna keep on going. You guys just keep on listening. Thanks for listening. I know, I wish I had those initials. That'd be great. E-E-H-H. Keep on keeping on. Alrighty. Chapter the 2nd. Not pausing even to take a seat, but standing where I was, with the skirt of my cheap cotton at-home dress nearly in the fire, I read. Events sure to send a frisson of horror through any spine with delicacy of feeling have unfolded in Bloomsbury, with implications taking in the whole of London, if a missing British gentleman is not soon found. Dr. John Watson, a respected physician, perhaps best known as companion of and chronicler of the adventures of the famous detective Mr. Sherlock Holmes, has most mystifyingly disappeared without a trace. Foremost among the thoughts of the absent man's family and friends, of course, is terror lest he might have fallen into the hands of some criminal enemy of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to be used as a pawn in some nefarious scheme, banded as a hostage, or dispatched for the sake of revenge. Alternatively, concern has been expressed that, carrying his black bag identifying him as a physician, he might have been attacked by an anti-vaccination mob in the East End. No form of foul play at this time may be ruled out. Attempts are being made to trace Dr. Watson's movements this Wednesday last, on which he departed to perform customary calls and errands, but failed to return to his home and business in the evening. Cab drivers are being questioned, and so forth. A great many words to describe, essentially nothing. An absence not newsworthy at all if it were not that my brother's name could be deployed in the headline. Dr. Watson had kissed his wife goodbye on Wednesday morning. This was Friday afternoon. The good doctor had been gone for 2 days. I imagined the police were saying, with some justification, that any number of harmless events might have caused the doctor's absence, and at any moment a telegram or letter should arrive explaining where and why he might have been detained. Attempts are being made meant that police are not yet investigating. Otherwise the newspaper would have named the inspector in charge. No, at this point the only people really trying to locate Dr. Watson were two, his wife and his friend, my brother Sherlock Holmes. And now one more. Me. But wait, what if Watson's absence had been arranged by my brother as a scheme to entrap me? Sherlock knew that I had embroiled myself in 2 cases of missing persons, and while he might not understand that I had invented Dr. Leslie Ragaston, scientific Praetorian, quite possibly he knew I had worked for the man. Did he appreciate that this was my life's calling, to be a finder of the lost? Did he guess how very fond I was of the fatherly Dr. Watson? Should I not, then, regard recent developments with the utmost suspicion? But even as these eminently sensible considerations traversed my mind, I already was throwing the newspaper on the fire, then rummaging in my wardrobe, considering possible ways to disguise myself, possible strategies to find out the details of Dr. Watson's disappearance, how best to approach the matter. Indeed, a straitjacket could not have stopped me. Although I knew I would have to be very careful. which presented some difficulty, having spent the better part of this past month closeted in my lodging, bitter over my mother's failure to help me in my time of need, having been, in other words, idle and sulking. I now found myself woefully unprepared for action. There were a dozen items I required, but did not have. Wrapping a nondescript shawl around my head and shoulders, I sallied forth to acquire them. Mrs. Tupper would be pleased. I was going for a walk. I did walk all the way, because my emotions felt as tangled as the labyrinthine passages of slums, my thoughts as crowded and confused as the smutty tenements with their peaked garrets looming over me, and a long walk would perhaps help me compose my mind into some form of order. My surroundings, however, did not promote serenity. A pieman cried, "'Ot meat tarts, 2 for a penny," while street urchins capered around him, mocking, "Puppies and kittens, cats and rats," meaning the probable meats in his pies, and a constable came frowning along to rout the lot of them for blocking traffic. While the day was indeed springish, as Mrs. Tupper had said, the warming weather had increased the stench of the tenement privies, each of which served perhaps 200 of London's great unwashed, and of the nearby Thames, and of the gasworks looming over the slums like a bloated shining caterpillar on steel legs, blighting everything beneath it. Very well, I was perhaps failing to appreciate the beauty of the sunny day, a rarity in London, where the clouds of smoke generally held sway no matter what the weather elsewhere. But truly a hint of spring seemed only to increase the din and danger in the streets. I saw a district nurse in her old-fashioned black bonnet, long coat and white apron trying to make her way into a narrow court crisscrossed with clotheslines of washing, while lounging men and street brats, and even some women, shouted curses, throwing mud and stones and horse droppings at her. Brave woman, I thought, but I admit that my next consideration as I walked on was whether a nurse's garb might serve as a good disguise, or perhaps the military-style black skirt and red jersey of one of General Booth's Hallelujah lasses. It seemed to me that people encountering someone in uniform observed the clothing, not the individual. But Sherlock Holmes was no ordinary observer. Aware that I had masqueraded as a nun, he would be on the lookout for something else of the sort, a deaconess, a nanny, a nurse. No, I had to invent some disguise he could not possibly expect of me. By now, blessedly, I had left the East End behind me. Instead of threading my way between tenements, I now walked pavements along wider cobble streets, and ahead of me loomed the dome of St. Paul's, a Grecian-columned landmark that contrasted strangely, I thought, with the shiny steel gasworks just as tall, not to speak of the gargoyled Gothic steeples of other churches nearby, or the square-towered corniced Italianate residence I was just then passing. Most of London was such a hodgepodge, railroads and factories, but also edifices, French Second Empire and Moorish and Georgian and Regency, plus Tudor Revival or Classical, Revival this and Revival that, a city uncertain, like me, of what appearance to present. Here, even more so than in the East End, one saw all sorts of people. Well-dressed ladies shopped the haberdashers and milliners and perfumeries, moving briskly about their business so that they would not be mistaken for much-adorned ladies, of a different sort, loitering the pavements. Shop-girls mounted with the agility of goats to the tops of omnibuses, while visitors from the country gawked at everything. Delivery boys on bicycles, bandbox vendors with their wares on poles across their shoulders, chimney-sweeps trudging along as black as their brushes, ink-stained students carrying books, street musicians, gentlemen dressed in sober gray or black from head to toe, and gents, quite a different breed, swell dressers in search of amusement. My brothers had once hypothesized that I was masquerading as one of those. Here came a short-haired woman in a billycock hat with a coachman cape, a stick in one gloveless hand, the leash of a bull-terrier in the other. I am certain my brothers were afraid I was going to turn out even worse, perhaps puffing the cigar. By now I was walking in the city itself, that is to say, the oldest part of London. One would think the London centre, but not so. Not any more than the Tower of London's centre, or Covent Garden, Piccadilly Circus, or Trafalgar Square, or Buckingham Palace, or Westminster, where the Houses of Parliament were. London had no more centre than one of Mrs. Tupper's sheep's head stews did. Resisting any further comparison between the city's confusion and my own current state of mind, I made my way towards Holywell Street. A narrow, winding, dirty thoroughfare that could not have been more ironically misnamed nor misused. Its picturesque high-gabled old buildings were given over mostly to vendors of low publications and cheap photographic prints. However, I was not here to look at lithographs of young ladies exposing their petticoats and legs while lacing their Balmoral boots. I sought a vendor of a different sort. As far back as the time of Queen Elizabeth, Holywell Street had housed mercers, and echoes of that silk and fancy textile trade lingered on in the form of dealers in costume, finery, queer old clothing, and the like, for masquerades. Wooden signs carved in the shape of masks grinned or grimaced down upon me most unpleasantly as I shouldered and elbowed my way through the crowded lane. Not only was Holywell Street itself quite ancient, crooked, and narrow, but the print vendors' tawdry wares overflowed their shops into the pavements, reaching out for one. Indeed, as I struggled along, a winsome little girl, no more than 6 years old, plucked at my sleeve, offering to sell me what appeared at first glance to be a pack of playing cards. My second glance made me shudder, then hasten onwards. There, at least I saw, suspended from the overhanging eaves of vulnerable lath-and-plaster building, a wooden sign, which had likely been there as long as the structure itself. Carved in the shape of a rooster, it had to mark the shop for which I was searching. That's the end of the second chapter. Well, hello, Tara. A lioness in a catsuit would be really impressive. It is. You're like Splatoon chatting right now. It's the pink and green. The second half of chapter 2. Well, thanks for being here, Tara. I appreciate it. Yep. So, just finished chapter 2. You didn't miss a whole lot. Dr. Watson has been kidnapped and, we believe, held in an insane asylum. So there's that, and then Enola is trying to figure out, like, who she can re-identify herself as, and get a new identity and a new job, and try and find Dr. Watson as well. So that's all you've really missed. And that's okay, Tori. You don't have to be super active. I'm glad you're listening. Glad you're here. Glad you're all here. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. You're welcome. You're very welcome for the recap. Not a problem. Glad to have you guys here whenever you can be. I'd be reading to the wall if you guys weren't here, so I'm happy to have you. Alrighty, I'm just going to keep on going, okay? I have a little sip of my drink. You're welcome. Thanks for being here. Happy to read. My mom gave me a critique. She said I read too fast, so I'm trying to slow down a little bit so you can actually like understand what I'm saying. So if I am talking too quickly or reading too fast, then stop me and I'll try and slow down. So there we go. I mean, yeah, you guys are pretty much at the wall because my computer's up against the wall, so I'm basically looking at you anyways. So it just works out. Alright. Chapter the 3rd. I had found out about it during an adventure worth mentioning. A few weeks earlier, you see, my brother Sherlock had very nearly caught me, but in the crucial few minutes while he was summoning the constabulary to scour the streets for me, I had found an unlikely refuge, 221B Baker Street, that is to say, Sherlock's own lodgings, which I had entered by means of a plane tree, a rooftop, and a bedchamber window. Ever since, I had wondered how my brother had reacted when, returning to his rooms at dawn, he had discovered my burnt cast-off nun's habit in his grate and a few items missing from his wardrobe. I imagined he had felt utterly chagrined. Oddly, this thought did not make me smile. Now, if it had been Mycroft. Some other time, perhaps, as I was saying, hiding for several hours in Sherlock's lodging while he hunted me throughout every lane and alley, mews and court in the area, I had put the time to good use by examining my brother's possessions. That man had an entire cabinet full of wigs and false beards and so on, but also accoutrements of disguise utterly new to me. Face putty, stick-on warts and scars, dreadful, like ruined medieval battlements steeped in creosote. These words, guys. False teeth to cover his own well-kept ones, skull caps to make him look bald or partly so, skin pigments varying from ruddy to swarthy, various false fingernails, unkempt or yellow or rigid or overlong as if in mourning, a glue-on device to change the shape of his mouth and give him the look of a hare lip. Altogether, my eyes were opened wide. Where had my brother acquired such uncommonly useful items? Searching his desk then, I had found the receipts from various shops, most of them in the theater district, and frankly intended to serve the needs of the stage. I hardly thought I could pass as an actress, but a few items several years ago had come from a shop in Holywell Street, a shop called Chanticleer's. So I thought I would try there first. My brother had not purchased anything at Chanticleer's in some time. Perhaps the place had closed. But there was only one way to find out, and if the shopkeeper remained, excellent. My brother had taken his business elsewhere for whatever reasons, and I would be unlikely to encounter him. Chanticleer's, hence the sign carved in the shape of a rooster. Chanticleer meant rooster, just as Reynard meant a fox. Where the latter had come from I had no idea, but the former I had read in one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Struggling across the teeming street, Holywell always thronged with all manner of Londoners, ogling the pictures in the windows of the print shops. I elbowed my way towards my destination. Or was it my destination after all? Standing under the wooden rooster, which had probably hung there since Shakespeare's day, to catch my breath before entering, I saw the red lettering painted over the open door read simply and mysteriously, Pertolotes. Pertolotes. I'll spell it for you. I don't mind spelling these words because, I feel like it helps you guys understand the... Yeah, that's it. So, most peculiar. I went in to see what was what. Proceeding cautiously, I cast my glance anxiously about me, but neither of my brothers pounced from the shadows to seize me. Indeed, the shop seemed empty. Racks of sheet music flanked in the doorway. Some used books had collected in a corner, and the bins and counters displayed an interesting variety of wares. Items for parlor amusements, I decided as I scanned them, cards of various sorts, though not, I am glad to say, of the tawdry sort I had been offered on the street. Sets of dominoes, pegboard games, brightly colored pickup sticks, little play scripts, stereopticons with story photographs, and a terribly clever miniature printing kit with movable type and an inked pad. I was thoughtfully examining this last item when a contralto voice asked, "May I help you?" Looking up, I found myself facing a smiling woman of middle age who wore, along with a simple blouse and skirt, a comfortable yet unmistakable proprietorial air. This was her shop. Even so, it took a moment for my rather overstrained mind to remember that Pertolote was the name of the practical-minded hen in Chaucer's Chanticleer story. Yeah, okay, well now we figured it out. No wonder Sherlock Holmes had stopped coming here. Somehow ownership had passed from rooster to hen, so to speak, and as our old butler's wife had once told me, neither of my brothers ever could abide a strong-minded woman. Mrs. Pertolote? I inquired. Her smile warmed and widened as if at a private joke. Pertellity, she said, correcting my pronunciation so cordially that I felt as though I had been complimented for my attempt. She spells it out here, look. She spells it out right there. Pertellity. A large-boned woman, with a face like a platter, and not a pretty one either. She wore her graying hair combed flat, then wound into two buns, one over each meaty pendulous earlobe. "What became of Chanticleer?" I answered her smile, willing to share her amusement. "Oh, he met his better." "Yet you keep the carved rooster sign?" "Well, it's very old, and one must take care of old things, mustn't one?" Her smile broadened, yet I felt the topic dismissed. "How may I be of assistance?" Even though she dropped H's. That's clever. Look at that! Look at that! Even though she dropped H's. Her accent was not entirely Cockney, but pleasantly semi-cultured. I indeed tried to keep mine much the same as we conversed. Indicating the miniature portable printing kit, I asked, "Could one make calling cards with this?" She did not blink, did not seem to wonder why such a poorly clad woman would want any calling cards, much less wish to print her own. Indeed, she did not hesitate at all before answering, "Yes, indeed, but of a rather crude sort. I could make better ones for you in the back room if you just need a few." "Indeed," I nodded, "thank you. Might I look around your shop?" "Certainly." There were, in fact, many fascinating trifles and oddities for me to peruse, square wooden puzzles with tiles that could not be lifted out but slid within the frame. talking boards with numbers and letters for spiritualist experiments, velvet roses, music boxes, feather fans, silk scarves, visored masks, some quite excellent quality of wigs of long hair, most likely shorn from fever victims, or possibly female convicts. But I took the time mainly because I needed to think. I wanted to accept Pertellity's offer to make me quite a few calling cards. I foresaw needing at least one quite soon, but in order to have her print them I must settle on an alias for myself. Regarding which, my musings resumed where I had left off. Ever me, no, ever I, every, even worse. Ever so, given a French twist, ever so. Not bad. Very well, perhaps I should not have to use it for long, but what of a first name? Violet? No, a flower name too risky. Viola? More evocative of a musical instrument than of a flower. Viola would do. If the shop owner were greedy, I ruminated, she could have sold me the miniature printing press for far more money than she would make by herself printing a few cards for me on, apparently, a better press that she owned. Hence I found myself inclined to trust her, even though Pertellity was almost certainly not her real name. No matter, she was not to know my real name either. In addition to the calling cards, might I safely buy even some more compromising items from her? I found myself inclined to think so. But what if I were mistaken about her? What if she were the sort to talk? It hardly mattered, for neither Mycroft nor Sherlock were ever likely to speak with her. Either one of them would shudder to go near such a woman, plainly, in possession of herself, her own business, and her affairs. Neither of my brothers would accept or understand a woman unattached to some man as wife, daughter, or sister. Both of them dismissed women as beyond the comprehension of logical thought. Neither of them could imaginatively enter the mind of any woman, much less mine. When I, a beaked-nosed beanpole of girl, had run away, I am sure they had quite expected to find me disguised as a boy to their way of thinking. How else could such an unfortunately plain female possibly manage? But now they knew that I had masqueraded as a widow, and later as a nun, so probably they were on the lookout for another variation of the ugly as a crow theme, a sharp-faced veiled spinster perhaps, or a scowling platform woman attempting to reform the slums. Probably they had stopped looking for me in male guise, so perhaps now it was time for me to adopt trousers? No. I simply did not want to, but more important, I had decided that in order to find the details concerning the disappearance of Dr. Watson, I would call upon Mrs. Watson, and in order to do that I needed to be a woman. But not such a woman as my brothers would ever suspect or even dream I could be. Indeed, although I knew the undertaking would involve a tremendous amount of work, I would disguise myself in the last way that either Sherlock or Mycroft would ever possibly envision. I would be beautiful. That's the end of the 3rd chapter. Oh, it's okay, Tori. It's okay. I hope everything is all right. Yeah, I never really read Canterbury Tales, so... It's okay, you can just back it up and catch up later. It's okay, it's all going to be on YouTube regardless, so please feel free to fill everything in. Oh, okay, just got called in dinner and everything. Yeah, no worries. Don't worry about it. It's all good. I'm glad you're here, glad you're able to listen as best you can, and this will be immortalized on the internet for the whole world to see. Yeah. So... Yeah, I like these, that's one of the things in this last chapter, that's one of the things I like about these books so much, is that it's so different. So many books with a young heroine in, like, 16, 17, 1800s, 1900s time frame, like, if they have a young female protagonist, on her own, they typically have to, like, go disguise themselves as men in order to, like, make it through society or whatever. And so that's one thing that this book is very different. It's, to kind of break outside that gender norms, I guess, for lack of better terms. So, it is starting to get a little stormy over here, so please let me know if anything, cuts out or doesn't stream properly, because I don't want to have to read this whole book again. So just let me know. But right now my frame rates are okay, and I think everything's going okay. I don't think it is. Like, I just heard thunder, but it's not raining, so I think it's okay over here. Yeah, it might move down this way, but I don't know. It's not really raining yet. In Final Fantasy VII, the main male character wound up dressing as a woman to help save the world or something. Pointless fact. I think that's a really interesting fact. Wound up dressing as a woman, you know? Sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do to save the world, right? Alrighty. Pressing on. Been live for like 40 minutes or so. Okay. Chapter the 4th. I would be beautiful. This was, I admit, a decision prompted partly by spleen, bitterness of spirit caused by my mother, but deflected onto the more acceptable target of men. I had too often observed how men treated women, plain versus pretty. I planned to embark upon a kind of angry experiment. I would prove that these almighty males could be fooled. But this was also a practical decision, for if I was walking into a trap, I could not yet dismiss the possibility that my brother and Watson had concocted an elaborate scheme to take me in. If it were so, why, I must walk out again unrecognized. Even if the crisis were genuine, as I was more inclined to believe, then Mrs. Watson was sure to be in close touch with Sherlock Holmes, and if she were to mention to him that a tall, thin, ill-favored girl with a pronounced nose and chin had come calling, he would certainly suspect it was me, and he would be on my trail like a bloodhound. If, however, Mrs. Watson were to mention a visitor of unusual comeliness, he would pay no attention whatsoever. There was only one drawback to being beautiful. I wanted Mrs. Watson to confide in me, but women, even those who are themselves pretty, often dislike an attractive woman. And while unacquainted with Mrs. Watson personally, I knew she herself was unexceptional in appearance, having read in Dr. Watson's excellent account, The Sign of the Four, how he had met Mary Morstan, as she was then called, when she had consulted Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Watson had described his wife to be as having neither regularity of feature nor beauty of complexion. But he went on to say that her expression was sweet and amiable, and her large blue eyes were singularly spiritual and sympathetic. Perhaps being good-natured, she would not after all resent me. Also from The Sign of the Four, I had learned that Mrs. Watson possessed no relatives in England, hence her visit to Holmes when she found herself in perplexity. Her mother and father were dead. After boarding school, she had been a governess, not exactly a servant, but hardly on equal standing with her employers either. Most governesses dined alone, and alone, I suspected, was how she might find herself even now, for as a physician's wife, she remained in a position halfway between working class and gentry. If she had led a retired life, having no circle of friends before her marriage, was she likely to have one since? I judged not. Poor folk who were in trouble ran straight to Mary, according to Dr. Watson. Doubtless she shared his kindness of heart, but in her own time of trouble would those same poor folk comfort her? I doubted it. Some people wished to be alone in times of trial, but others craved company. While I had no way of knowing, I must take a chance that Mrs. Watson might be one of the latter, and might very much welcome the diversion of a visitor, even a stranger, at this difficult time. I hoped so. Indeed, I hoped she would tell me something, however trivial, that would help me enlighten the mystery of her missing husband. A truly lovely creature descended from a cab in front of Dr. Watson's office/residence the next afternoon. Lovely with an innocent, modest, timeless beauty, so artless that she wafted up the scrubbed white steps like a breath of fresh woodland air. Artless? Ha! Hardly. Hours and hours of work had gone into the preparation of Miss Viola Everso, and I could never have achieved such artlessness if it were not that the blood of artists runs in my veins. Natural beauty is all a matter of illusion, you see, an arrangement of proportions to foster a conspiracy of admiration among the senses of the beholder. My brother Sherlock had once mentioned something of the sort. Mycroft, he said to my other brother, the girl's head, you'll observe, is quite small in proportion to her remarkably tall body. He had been negatively assessing my intelligence at the time, and his conclusion was mistaken, but his statement itself was quite true. Therefore I had purchased at Pertelites, had to remember how to pronounce that. I had purchased at Pertelites a wig of exceptional luxuriance. Arrangement of proportions in the case of feminine pulchritude means, first and foremost, arrangement of hair. And my own hair, even if it were not the color of mud and the consistency of a marsh, is annoyingly located atop my head where I cannot possibly see it or reach it to properly address it. But the wig! What a difference! I simply set it upon a candlestick in front of me, then arranged its shining rosewood-hued tresses until I got them exactly the way I wanted them. Ringlets and a careless chignon. I never pronounced that correctly, but it's hair. At the crown, leaving a generous fringe around the forward edges. Without the wig and without the inserts I used to round my cheeks and nostrils, I was a sharp-faced, hawk-nosed, sallow-skinned female version of my brother Sherlock. But lovely and convincingly natural-looking hair so amended the proportions of my head that my pronounced nose and chin miraculously transformed into a classical Grecian profile. Framed by russet fringe and tresses, my skin looked not pallid, but delicately porcelain. Even I could scarcely believe the transformation. There was more, much more to be done, of course. Natural beauty requires a flaw, a certain wanton violation of symmetry, so I glued a small raised port wine birthmark, courtesy of Perteletes, at my right temple, where it served to draw attention away from the center of my face, that is to say, my proboscis. I then dusted my face with rice powder as if attempting to hide the slight blemish. The rice powder was permissible for a lady to use, but the next item I took in hand, rouge, was not. I had to apply the disreputable substance very subtly to my cheekbones and lips. Then I had Spanish papers with which to rub my eyelids, making my eyes appear large and lustrous, but not so much that the artifice could be detected. It took me many attempts to get them right. As I have said, becoming beautiful required hours and hours of labor. I just have to say, gentlemen watching this video or stream, this is what women do every day to try and look presentable to get out the door in the morning. With might I add, no guarantee at all that Mrs. Watson would receive me. It was quite possible that under the circumstances she had taken to her bed in nervous prostration, unable to entertain visitors even if she were willing. Stars and garters, what if I were turned away from her door after all this work? But one could but try, and at last I was ready. Taking a final look in the mirror, I must say I felt an unexpectedly fierce sensation of triumph. Mrs. Tupper, unfortunately, happening to see me going out, dropped the china pitcher she was carrying. It smashed to bits. On that percussive note, I took my cab to the Watson address, and if I wafted up the steps like a woodland breeze, it is because of my Sylvian Paradise eau de toilette, also purchased the day before. I had never in my life bothered with fragrance. Let the gutters stink all they liked. I was never one to hold a scented handkerchief to my nose. But the beauty, as I have said, lies not only in the eyes of the beholder, but in a carefully orchestrated conspiracy of all the senses, hence perfume. And I had swallowed honey to sweeten my voice. Corseting myself, I had made doubly sure that my bust enhancer remained free of lumps from any of the various objects I stored therein. Also, I had chosen my dress, as you might imagine, with great care, to appear neither humble nor aristocratic. Every artless thing about me, from my gypsy bonnet, a small flat hat with a few flowers, to my polished button-top boots, was the result of hours of trial and deliberation. Indeed, I had been up half the night preparing for this encounter. I could only hope that my sleeplessness gave soulful depth to the expression of my eyes. At that moment I reached my destination. Of course, doubt swept in. What if I were a fool? What if the whole world could see I was merely a crow masquerading as a peacock? Just at that wretched moment, naturally, the door opened. But the bouquet I carried, snowdrops and jasmine, hope and sympathy, carefully arranged and bound by a yellow ribbon, explained my presence. There was no need for me to speak. I hoped that the parlour-maid did not notice how my gloved hand trembled as I laid my calling card, Miss Viola Everso, on her silver tray. That's the end of chapter 4. Artlessness, yes. Oh my gosh, all the rhymes. Oh, thanks, Terror. You're so sweet. Lions don't need makeup. They look great no matter what. Thanks for clapping. I'm making much faster progress than I expected in this book. Normally I do like 6 chapters, and then 6, but we're already on chapter 5, so I'm just going to keep on going. Sorry. Felt like I had to burp, and I didn't want to be rude on camera. Would you guys like a mint? I have mints. You can have one. See how many pages are left in this. Well, I think we'll definitely finish chapter 6. I might keep going. Let's see. Alrighty. Chapter the 5th. The maid showed me into a very modest parlor, then whisked away towards the back of the house to find her mistress. I stood looking around me. Each parlor window had been raised exactly 2 inches. Fortunately, in this part of London, the spring air stank only of smoke and street muck, odors mostly offset by the fragrance of the flowers I carried. In London, I had come to realize those with any spare income at all considered flowers not a luxury but a necessity for their homes and persons in order to make living bearable to the sense of smell. From the back of the house I heard a soft voice ask, "Who is it, Rose?" And then, without waiting for an answer, with my card still in her hand, Mrs. Watson entered the parlor, her face very pale yet composed. With quiet but warm concern, she asked, "Have you come to see the doctor? I'm afraid he's not in. Is there anything I can do for you?" I stood astonished, for I could see how red and swollen her eyes were. No longer could I doubt in the slightest that Dr. Watson indeed had disappeared, for Mrs. Watson's distress was genuine and evident, yet she expected to render service, not receive sympathy. This amazing woman shamed me so much that, handing her the simple bouquet I brought with me, I could barely speak coherently. I read about it in the news," I babbled, "and I cannot imagine why, for he's so very kind, your husband, I mean. I do hope he is all right. I beg your pardon for intruding at such a difficult time, but I thought perhaps some flowers—" Other bouquets had arrived, I saw, but no, not so many as to crowd the small parlor. "How very thoughtful of you, thank you." Mrs. Watson's lip trembled as she accepted the snowdrops and jasmine from me, but her gentle gaze upon my face remained inquiring. "I have been a patient of your husband's," I added hastily in reply to her unspoken request that I should please explain myself, as I should have done in the beginning. She nodded, humbly accepting the presence of a very young, rather bird-brained, and quite attractive, I hoped, stranger in her parlor. "You'll forgive me, I'm sure. I do not know all of his patients." "You can hardly be expected to, and when I saw in the paper, well, I just had to do something, for he not only remedied my difficulty, but showed the greatest tact and sympathy in doing so." This was true, in a way. When lying, I always make every possible use of the truth. I can carry it off better that way, and remember more easily what I have said. "But how thoughtful of you. What a lovely gesture, your being here." Feeling painfully like a fraud, I mentally reminded myself quite sternly that I was here to help her. "What lovely flowers," she continued, cradling them in one arm as if holding a baby. "Miss Everso, I'd be most obliged. I mean, if it is no inconvenience. Would you care to stay a while and have some tea?" It was as I had thought it might be. No matter what her natural reserve, at this time of trouble Mrs. Watson needed someone, any safe and sympathetic listener, to talk to. As soon as we were seated, with only the slightest encouragement from me, she began to tell me how her husband had left the house in excellent humor this past Wednesday morning, planning to make some house calls, then perhaps stop at his club, but in the evening he had not returned. I kept his supper warm till it turned to cinder," she said in a sort of bewilderment, "and still I could not bring myself to throw it into the dustbin, because to do so would have been to acknowledge that he was terribly overdue, and I could not yet admit that something had happened. I kept telling myself he would be home any minute. He had to be." She had waited all night for him, and in the morning she had sent for the police, and, of course, for Sherlock Holmes. She assumed correctly that I understood her husband's association with the famous detective. The police had arrived first, but refused to take any action until they saw evidence of a crime. They said, "Wait a bit. It's not uncommon for a man to disappear for a day or 2 or 3, then come home all sheep-faced, having spent the time drunk or in an opium den with some loose woman." Did they actually say that? I exclaimed. Not in so many words, but one could tell well enough what they meant, as if John would ever do such things. Even in the heat of righteous indignation, Mrs. Watson's tone remained sweet. Luckily, Mr. Sherlock Holmes came soon after and set about finding out what had happened. And has he done so? He said I would not hear from him until he had something to report, and I have not. He has no theory? He wonders whether some villain is attempting revenge against him, of course. John himself has no enemies. No disagreeable patients? Well, of course there is always that. Mr. Holmes took John's medical record books to check. Good. Then she saw herself... Oh, excuse me. Good. Then she herself was unlikely to look up Viola Everso in them. I leaned towards her. Mrs. Watson, what do you think has happened? For a moment her composure faltered. She had to lift her hands to her face. I truly cannot imagine. Just then the maid brought in the tea tray. Making a visible effort, Mrs. Watson rallied, and, as she poured, changed the subject. Do you live with your family here in London, Miss, Everso? I told her that no, I lived alone, had worked in an office, and was without employment just now, and hoped to find a position in Fleet Street. All true, not that it mattered. If I had told her I rode bareback in a circus, she would have nodded just the same, for her distress was such that she could comprehend nothing. We sipped tea in awkward silence. For something to say, I complimented the room in which we sat. Such lovely lithographs. I quite approve of the combination of comfortable furnishings with touches of culture. I quite approved of Mrs. Watson herself, actually, so bravely serving a second cup of tea while she looked round her own parlor as if she had never been there before. I added, what a lovely little spinet. Having been a governess, of course she had spent half her life at the keyboard of a piano, but I asked anyway, do you play? She scarcely heard the question, of course, poor thing. Oh, yes, Her sorely preoccupied thoughts wandered, apparently, to a posy of daisies placed upon the instruments. So many flowers do serve to console one, she remarked vaguely. Somewhat, at least, and from strangers yet. People are so kind. Nodding agreement, I privately thought she was rejoicing over crumbs, for there were not many flowers at all. There was, of course, the bouquet I had brought, which, I was glad to see, the maid had placed in a vase exactly as I had arranged it. There was a little nosegay of lily of the valley, wishing Mrs. Watson the return of happiness. There was the ubiquitous carnations, some white roses, and tucked away on a corner table the most bizarre bouquet I had ever seen in my life. I am sure I sat up straighter and my eyes widened, but I kept myself from saying anything more than a murmured, "How peculiar." What? Slowly Mrs. Watson turned to see what had caught my attention. Oh yes, odd, isn't it? The poppies should be red, but they're white, and the May should be white, but it's red, and I have no idea what the greens are. Asparagus, I marveled. Not the vegetable, of course, but the cobwebby fronds that spring up afterwards, with leaves like sparse gray-green hair. Once it's grown, you know. Which it should not be at this time of year, only the spears should be sprouting from the ground. Mrs. Watson blinked. My goodness, how clever you are. How did you learn that? My mother was a botanist. True enough, and it might have been said that half the genteel ladies in England, flowers and botany were considered to be a female hobby. And she studied asparagus? I've never seen it placed in a bouquet before. Neither have I. But if the greens were bizarre, the blossoms were worse. Their significance chilled me. Taking care not to reveal this in the tone of my voice, I asked, Mrs. Watson, are you familiar with what is sometimes called the language of flowers? Only a little. There has been small occasion for such communication in my life, she said, this with gentle good humor. The May signifies hope, does it not? And the poppy comfort? In the French tradition, yes. But this was England, and in British folklore, hawthorn, what she called May, was a shrub long associated with pagan deities and with fairies, a powerful symbol of bad luck. No countrywoman would ever bring a sprig of its pretty cluster blossoms indoors, for to do so might bring down calamity upon the house, even death. I did not say this, but I did say, the red poppy implies comfort, I believe, but the white poppy symbolizes sleep. Really? She thought about that for a moment, then actually smiled. Well, certainly I could use some sleep. What a very odd bouquet. Who, might I ask, gave it to you? Why, I don't know. I believe a boy brought it to the door. Setting my cup of tea aside, I stood, crossing the room to have a better look. The poppies must have been forced in a hothouse. All flowers except snowdrops came from hothouses this time of year. Nothing remarkable in that. But the asparagus should have been so cultivated. most peculiar. Explicable, perhaps, if someone had a boundless yearning for the vegetable, but the hawthorn, who on earth would have the trouble with such a useless prickle bush as hawthorn in a hothouse, when like a weed it grew everywhere in the countryside? Upon studying the hawthorn more closely, I saw that its jagged branches were wound round with tendrils of a delicate white vine whose white flowers had already wilted. Bindweed. A sort of wild trumpet flower, bindweed would be as common as sparrows in country hedgerows come summertime, but like the hawthorn this early in the year, it must have been forced indoors. More, it must have been cultivated with the hawthorn to entwine it so. Bindweed, more correctly known as convolvulus. The plant indicated something convoluted, something stealthy, entangling, twisted. And this ominous bouquet, it seemed to me, had come from quite a twisted mind. I had to find out. But as I turned to question Mrs. Watson in more detail, the parlour-maid burst open, and without waiting for the maid to announce him at all, a tall, impeccably clad, yet vehement gentleman strode in, almost swooped in, his manner as hawk-like as the keen profile of his face, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. That's the end of chapter 5. You're a loose woman. You make your mother sad. So true. Oh, poor Terror. Mom always said you were a loose woman. You made her sad. Probably. Yeah, that's probably true. She probably is just sadder that you weren't a bit looser. Sherlock's here! Yes, but Sherlock's not the hero in this book. We don't want him to catch Enola. We don't want him here. Thank you, thank you. I should take a bow. I'm gonna keep on going if you guys are okay with that. I think I'm gonna get quite a bit more done today. We'll see. And I think I might keep going even after chapter 6. So, yes, this is Enola's book. We have to be on her side for this story. But I love Sherlock Holmes. That's why I started reading this book, because he was my hero when I was growing up. I decided I was going to be a detective when I grew up, just like Sherlock Holmes. And then I realized that, like, being a detective isn't really the same as being Sherlock Holmes. Not really. It's not the same anymore. So. Yep, you're so right, Tara. So right. Donnie Bill. Alright. Chapter the 6th. I regret to say that I gasped aloud, both in terror and in admiration. Those two emotions seem always to attend my dealings with my renowned brother. To me his craggy features were the most handsome in England, his grey eyes the most brilliant, and if circumstances were different, but there was no time for pointless dreams. I fully comprehended all the peril of my situation, and I admit that I felt a strong inclination to flee. Luckily, in contemplation of the bizarre bouquet, I stood so near the wall that it checked my impulse to back away. Had I made such an ill-considered move, I am sure my brother might have noticed. But he barely glanced at me, although it took me several thudding heartbeats to comprehend why, for there I stood in plain sight, his tall, gawky, long-nosed sister Enola, until I realized that my disguise had kept him from really looking at me. Indeed, the moment he saw a winsomely coiffed and attired young woman in the parlor along with Mrs. Watson, he turned his attention elsewhere. One might think he disliked to be in company with such a woman, and if I gasped aloud, he did not hear it, for at the same time Mrs. Watson jumped up with a cry. "Mr. Holmes!" She stretched both hands towards him. Is there any news of John?" To judge by his taut and somber face, not any good news. As if capturing two fluttering doves, he took Mrs. Watson's hands in his kid-gloved grasp, but he did not speak, only made a shushing motion with his lips, and threw a warning glance in my direction. Oh, how thoughtless of me! Hardly what he meant to convey. He wanted her to get rid of me, but she seemed to feel that she had been rude, forgetting to introduce me. Freeing her hand, she turned to me. Miss, If one is literally trembling with ill-mixed emotion, one might as well make the best use of it. Relieving Mrs. Watson of the necessity of remembering my name, I squealed, Is this really Mr. Sherlock, Mr. Holmes, the great detective? Simulating the great girlish excitement, I hurried forward, smiling, nay, grinning like a skull. Oh, I am so thrilled! I squeaked, my voice a full octave above its usual level. Even as I quaked in fear that my brother might recognize me, I grasped one of his gloved hands in both of mine. Oh, just wait until I tell my aunt that I met the famous Mr. Sherlock Holmes! My effusions had the effect I desired. If a sewer rat had crawled upon Sherlock, it might have repulsed him less. He could not bear to look at me in the face, turning his head away as he said frostily, Miss Everso, Miss Viola Everso, I burbled. Miss Everso, would you kindly excuse us? Of course. Absolutely. I know you and Mrs. Watson. That is, you have more important matters to discuss. I am frightfully honored and delighted to have met you. Twittering inanities, I allowed myself to be ushered away by the faithful parlour-maid Rose, who had appeared for that purpose with my wrap in her hands. Even after I heard the front door of the Watson residence close behind me, I could not quite believe my escape. Mincing down the stone steps, I expected at any moment to hear Sherlock shout, Wait a moment! Enola? Enola! Constable, stop that girl in the wig! But instead I heard his voice speaking to Mrs. Watson. There is no very good news, I'm afraid. The words, although quietly and gravely spoken, carried clearly to me through the partially opened parlour windows. But I have found something. I have found Watson's medical bag. I stopped on the pavement where I stood. Oh my goodness, I couldn't simply leave. The sound of my brother's voice acted upon me like a magnet upon needles and pins. I had to know more, but what if I were caught listening? Pretending to search my pockets for something, I glanced up and down the street, which lay quiet except for a milkmaid making her deliveries and a cab or two. London is odd that way. Slum streets brawl, always with women standing in open doorways, shouting at one another, children running amuck in the muck, beggars, vendors, drunkards, idlers, but the better residential streets lie almost empty. There, scrubbed doorsteps lead up to closed doors, flanked by windows without a single broken pane of glass. Instead, one sees potted geraniums, a canary in a hanging cage, a meek little room-to-let sign, lace curtains. But one cannot tell whether one is being watched from behind the lace curtains. Holmes spoke on. I found it at his club, where someone had stowed it out of sight behind a davenport. It remained unnoticed until today. But John would not have left. Mrs. Watson's quiet voice struggled against tears. Exactly. My brother's voice also repressed strong emotion. My heart swelled when I heard such controlled anguish in his words. No doctor, least of all Watson, would ever willingly be separated from his black bag. Wary of my own feelings, I realized I was quite likely to betray myself with a whimper of some unequally undignified involuntary utterance. Enola, you silly chit, I mentally scolded myself. Get away! I moved, however, only a few steps, just enough so that Holmes and Mrs. Watson would not see me if either of them happened to glance outside. I put myself on a line with the corner of the house and of the parlour. There I stood fiddling with my gloves while trying to calm my breathing and the pounding of my heart. I could still hear my brother speaking. Therefore, I think we can now rule out the possibility of accident. Watson was purposefully lured or spirited away by some person or agency unknown. Mrs. Watson's soft reply was inaudible to me. I cannot be certain, but it seems to me that the anti-medical elements, yammering as if surgery were vivisection, tend towards hysteria, and are unlikely to act with such organized decision. Yet although improbable, it remains just as possible as do other hypotheses. Some enemy from Watson's army days, perhaps. I have been looking into that possibility, but my instincts tell me otherwise. Above all, I continue to suspect the criminal underworld, but my informants so far have been able to tell me nothing. It is as if one moment Watson were simply playing billiards at his club, and the next the earth opened up. With a tattoo of hooves on cobbles, a delivery van rattled past, the driver glancing at me curiously, probably wondering why I was standing there. In London, any unchaperoned woman who pauses even for a moment to blow her nose puts herself in danger of being taken for a social evil, the polite term for a lady of the night. It is this silence, this hiatus, that I cannot understand, Sherlock was saying when the noise had passed. If Watson was kidnapped, why no demand for ransom? If taken by some enemy, why no gloating message of revenge? We should have heard from such a tormentor by now. Have you anything to report? Anything at all out of the ordinary? Her reply was brief. Flowers, said Holmes with a dismissive impatience, but surely such social gestures are to be expected. No, or if we are to involve the police, we need something more than a black bag and an anonymous bouquet. Please think. Is there nothing? Mrs. Watson said something in broken tones. It is true, logic suggests no reason why murder might not have taken place. My brother's voice had tightened to the breaking point. And in that case there would be no communication. Yes, I have thought it too, yet I cannot give up hope. One must not give up hope. And, he added with black fire flaring in his tone, I will not rest until I have got to the bottom of this affair. A considerable silence followed, during which another vehicle trundled past. This time, a brougham, the driver and occupants eyeing me askance. I felt like a target set up for marksmanship practice. Finally, my brother spoke again. We must persevere. We cannot do otherwise. Can you think of nothing to help me? Silence. Have you had visitors, other than that syrupy young woman who'd left just now? Who was she, by the way? Oh, my goodness, my nerves could take no more. I left, walking down the street in the manner recommended by a lady's moral companion, self-possessed and quietly, with not too much lagging and not too swift a step, looking as if one understands what one is about. Only after I had rounded a corner did I let my breath out. I wondered whether I had now been added to Sherlock's list of suspects. I certainly hoped not. I did not want him interested in the syrupy young woman, all the more so because he must not waste his time while trying to find out what happened to Watson. But he was wasting his time, I realized as I entered a crowded thoroughfare of shops and businesses. Avoid lounging about the shop windows, resolutely forego even the most tempting displays of finery, pass men without looking at them, yet all the while seeing them. Brilliant as my brother was at unraveling many sorts of perplexities, he continued to err by neglecting the women's sphere. In this case, the message is conveyed by flowers. It seemed to me that a gloating message of revenge had indeed arrived from the form of hawthorn, poppies, convolvulus, and the oddest of greens, asparagus. The asparagus I did not at all understand. Nevertheless, I felt fairly sure that the bizarre bouquet had not come from the criminal underworld, nor from anyone Watson had known in the army. No, I thought, it had come from someone who would not last long in either of those organizations, someone too odd for them, someone eccentric, petty, and spiteful in quite a creative way, someone enjoying an interesting garden variety of gleeful madness, and someone so dedicated to the pursuit of botanical malice that he or she grew hawthorn in a hothouse. And that's the end of chapter 6. I'm gonna scroll up and catch up. Sandwich is a great dinner, I just have to say. I eat Jimmy John's for dinner, like, all the time. It's so good. I know, I'm just flying through this book. I don't think I've ever read this quickly. It usually takes me like an hour and a half to 2 hours to get through 6 chapters. I don't know. It's like this book is shorter, but I don't think it is shorter. Well, maybe it is shorter. It looks kind of shorter than the other ones. Who knows? I'm gonna go get a drink, but I will be right back. I'm gonna go get another drink, and I will be right back, and we'll keep going, if you guys are good with that. So, talk amongst yourselves like you haven't been doing that this whole time, and I'll be right back. Alrighty. I'm back. I must have leveled up my reading skills, because I'm just doing a great job. You can't miss me that quickly. That's super exciting. All your giveaway gifts. I like how 2 of them you're going to have to ship out of the country. It's pretty awesome. Thanks, it's good to be back. I'm glad I'm back. Great to see you guys. Thanks for being here. So, You were not. Stop it. You were not lost without me being here. Don't even. Just don't even. I might be able to get this book done in 2 parts instead of 3. That's true. 1 does fit in a letter. So. Sorry. Whew. Alrighty, guys. I'm going to keep on going if you guys want to stick around for some more. It's only 7:20 here. I've been live for not even an hour and 20 minutes. So, we're just going to keep going. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you. If anyone's watching this on YouTube, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. We'll keep going. Chapter the 7th. But how to find this interesting person? 3 possible schemes came to mind, and while one, locate and investigate hothouses, would take too long, another seemed more hopeful. I immediately put it into action, finding a place to sit down and write. As it was a fine day, I chose a bench near one of West London's new public drinking water fountains. Quite as big as most war memorials, and surmounted by winged figures, halfway up its magnificence flared a basin intended, I think, to look like a scallop shell, but more resembling a fungus jutting from a tree, with a porpoise-shaped spout giving forth refreshment for ladies and gentlemen. Lower down, a similarly ornate trough was provided for the pleasure of horses, and lower yet, near the pavement, a smaller trough for the use of dogs, and I supposed cats, rats, and street urchins. Sitting, as I have said, where I could view the intermingled species enjoying this monument to benevolent hygiene, I drew paper and pencil from a pocket and composed a message to be placed in all the personal columns of all the London newspapers. After several attempts, I distilled it to the greatest simplicity. Hawthorn, convolvulus, asparagus, and poppies. What do you want? Reply this column, MMW. The initials stood for Mary Morstan Watson, as if the query had been posted by her. Satisfied, I recopied this numerous times for London's plethora of publications. Then, by hopping onto a passing tram, which as a modern urban woman I had learnt to do without stopping the horses, I paid my penny, and I was rewarded with a ride to, eventually, Fleet Street. Many a time I had visited the Fleet Street offices of the various news publishers, and had been waited upon politely but indifferently by various male clerks. This time, however, while even more than usually polite, they seemed far from indifferent. Preoccupied as I was by concerns other than my appearance, I did not at first realize the reason for the change. Oh, for goodness sake, I fumed to myself when I remembered I was wearing a great deal of hair and Lady Be Fair artifice. What fools! After I had delivered and paid for all my advertisements, the day was turning to night, and I was getting quite tired. But I could not yet rest, for I needed immediately to pursue my other scheme to identify the sender of the bizarre bouquet. One does not cultivate hawthorn twined with bindweed, yet in a hothouse, just for a single triumphant moment, such as... One does not cultivate hawthorn twined with bindweed, yet in a hothouse, just for a single triumphant moment. Such a spiteful person, I believed, would continue to send his or her messages of hatred in floral form. And when the next one arrived, I wanted to be in position to observe and intercept. Therefore I needed to return to the scene. So much the better that night had now fallen. Darkness was to my advantage, lessening the likelihood that Mrs. Watson might see me as I re-entered her street of residence. For additional concealment I hailed a cab. I had the cab driver pull up directly in front of my destination, and I had him wait, so that the cab, a big four-wheeler, stood between me and the residence of John Watson, M.D. The house with the room to let sign in the window, you see, stood almost directly across the street from the Watsons. Mentally I begged fate or fortune as I plied the door-knocker. Please, might the room in question have a window facing that direction? It did. Perfect. Perfect, I mean in that one all-important aspect. In others it was dreadful. Chill, bare, and cheerless, with a bed as hard as a board and nearly as narrow, and a flinty-eyed, disagreeable landlady who named far too high a weekly cost. Small wonder the shrew's spare room had remained vacant until now. I haggled with her over rent and terms, but only for the sake of appearances. The truth was, I would have taken the room at whatever price, and ended up handing over my money and receiving my latchkey within a few minutes. I needed to be in place by the following morning, you see. Already, during the half-day I had spent away, a second suspicious bouquet might have arrived at the Watsons' door, a most provoking thought, but even so I felt no doubt that the malicious sender would eventually provide another, and when it arrived I must not miss it. So I had my cab driver take me to Aldersgate, where I dismissed him, and after going in one door of the railway station and out the other, I engaged another cab. Such precautions had become second nature to me. I must never forget that cab drivers can be questioned, and that I was a fugitive, with the world's greatest detective taking quite a personal interest in me. I had the other cab then take me to an East End street, where few, if any, cabs had gone before, that is to say my lodging, and I had the driver wait while I packed things I needed, meanwhile attempting to explain to a rather dismayed and doubtful Mrs. Tupper I'm going to visit my aunt for a few days. Eh? She lifted her hearing trumpet to her ear. I'm going to visit my aunt. Eh? With her watery old eyes widened to their utmost, she still could not understand, yet would not venture nearer to me. Standing in the doorway of my room, watching a lovely young lady throw clothing into a carryall, knowing that for the past month a girl who more resembled a scarecrow had barely stirred from the room, I am sure she wondered whether I had gone mad, whether she ought to summon a constable to have me committed, lest I constituted a threat to the body public. Eh? Going where? At this time of night? Going! Visit! Aunt! I shouted into her ear trumpet. With the satchel in each hand, I whisked past her out the door. The next morning, Sunday, found me applying rouge, birthmark, powder, etc., in order to face the day in a lovely ladylike guise. Quite a nuisance, this new disguise. All over London, women readying themselves for church were struggling less. But at least my wig did not yet need be restyled atop a bedpost, for I did not wish to put on the hot, heavy thing until necessary. It perched at the ready with its hat still pinned in place. So as not to be seen without it, I made the loathsome landlady bring my breakfast upstairs, leaving it on a tray outside my door. Meanwhile, corseted to simulate an hourglass figure, and wearing quite a fetching puffed and pleated Paris green day dress, I sat in the window with a pair of opera glasses close at hand, watching the street in general and the Watson residence in particular, while taking advantage of the concealing qualities of lace curtains. As regarded concealment, only my precipitous arrival made it necessary. After a few days it wouldn't matter if Mrs. Watson saw me about. Indeed, I might approach her and tell her how fortunate I had been to see the room to let sign on my previous visit, just when I was looking for a new lodging place, and was there any news of Dr. Watson. On the other hand, I quite hoped this vigil would not last so long as a few days, for even within the first few hours it had become exquisitely boring. Nice streets were too quiet. A scattered procession of cabs with Sunday licenses, scrubbed and shining in order that cleanliness might actually contain godliness, brought various neighbors, including Mrs. Watson, home from worship. Mrs. Watson, I noticed, took a few moments to pat the cab horse. Rare was the woman who would do that, especially at the risk of besmirching her Sunday best. I regarded Dr. Watson's winsome wife with mingled admiration and pity. She wore black as if she already were in mourning. After the churchgoers had gone indoors, nothing at all had happened for an hour or so. Eventually, a bent old woman in a shawl limped from door to door, selling violets from a large flat basket. That was all for the next half hour or thereabouts. A water wagon passed at a trot, the horse with the tail handsomely lifted, pleasing to watch, until one realized the nag was littering the length of the street with horse apples. Ironic, as the purpose of the water wagon was to clean London streets, typically covered with muck, and a respectable slug would not have crawled in. The labor of clearing it could not pause even for Sunday rest, for there were a great many horses in the city, and each one produced 45 pounds of waste per day, or so Mum had once told me. Don't think of Mum. To distract myself, I tugged at the tasteful opal brooch centered upon my dress front, thus drawing the slender dagger sheathed in the busk of my corset, the opal being its pommel. Hefting my weapon by its hilt, I felt reassured. I had used it once on a garroter. Although once an attacker of a different sort had used a knife on me, but my corset had foiled his attempt to stab me. Thus convinced of the value of corsets, I had provided myself with several specially made so that their metal ribs did not nip my waist or jab me under the armpits, only protected me from the likes of Jack the Ripper, while supporting the bust enhancer and hip regulators which disguised my stick-like figure while serving as carryalls containing emergency supplies, plus a small fortune in Bank of England notes, courtesy of Mum. Do not think about Mum. Hastily slipping my dagger between the buttons on the front of my dress, returning it to its sheath in my bosom, I set myself taking mental inventory of the other items therein. Bandaging, scissors, iodine, spare stockings, needle and thread. In her best blue cape and bonnet, a nanny walked past on the street below. Pushing a parasol perambulator with one hand, while the other she led a toddler in a lacy pink dress and white pinafore. Yawn. Headscarf, hair extensions, pince-nez, eyeglasses for disguise, lorgnette by the way of magnifying lens, smelling salts, sugar candies, biscuits. Around the far corner of the street appeared a small, ragged boy carrying a bunch of flowers nearly bigger than he was. Inventory and ennui at once forgotten. I grabbed for my opera glasses and peered through them, trying to identify the blossoms in the bouquet. But the boy, confounded ignorant street urchin, carried it under his arm, head down, as if it were likely to bite him otherwise. I could hardly see the flowers at all, and had to content myself for the moment with memorizing the boy's scruffy plaid clothing and rather stupid face. He paused with his mouth open to study each house number. Very possibly he might not be looking for the Watson residence at all, might not concern me whatsoever. My heart pounded in protest at the thought. Nonsense. It has to be. It was. After studying the number beside the door an inordinate length, he turned to ascend the steps of the Watson residence. Only then, as he put his back to me, could I catch the clear look at the bouquet. Laburnum, harebells, convolvulus again, wispy sprays of asparagus again, sprigs of yew. Ye gods. Dropping the opera glasses, I sprang up, popped my wig, hat and all, onto my head, snatched my mantle, and ran out of my temporary lodging and down the stairs, intent on catching that boy as soon as he had completed his delivery. And that's the end of chapter 7. That was a really abrupt end to that chapter. Oh, I hope it's your internet and not mine. Yeah, Fleet Street. Oh, thanks for clapping, guys. I hope you're enjoying your sandwich, Terror. Hope it's delicious. Hope it's delectable. So it's 7:30. Okay. I'm sorry your internet's not working well. I think I'm going to keep going if you guys are okay. I'm okay. I really hope that my internet's not crapping out. Because, I mean, my thing says it's doing well, so I hope it is on your side too. Alrighty. I'm gonna keep on trucking. Keep on keeping on. Yeah, I feel like this book is thinner than the other ones. I don't know. Don't know. Well, thanks. Thanks. I'm glad my internet seems fine. Chapter the 8th. Laburnum. It's a flower. Here's how it's spelled. Yes, there you go. Laburnum. Anyways, you see, while a very pretty flower hangs down in yellow cascades, weeping. The blue harebell, long associated with fairies, bad luck, and fey events, means submission to grief. The yew is a graveyard tree, signifying death. So even if it were not for the convolvulus and the asparagus fronds, I would have felt sure. These flowers came from the same spiteful source as that other bizarre bouquet, and might not this evil-minded person be responsible for the disappearance of Dr. Watson? I scooted downstairs, out the front door, and onto the street as quickly as possible, but only to find that the confounded fish-mouthed boy, who had approached the Watson residence so very slowly, now trotting off at a goodly pace, just disappearing around the opposite corner. Oh no. No, he was not getting away from me. Snatching up the front of my skirt with both hands, I ran after him. I am long of limb and love to run. I have always been the disgrace of my family, running, climbing, and generally acting like a biped, but that accursed skirt slowed me down even as I hoisted it to my knees, for doing so denied me the proper pumping action of my arms. Other parts of my personage compensated so that my head wobbled, and I swayed from side to side, altogether I am sure resembling a tall Paris green goose in a tremendous hurry. Onlookers regarded me with shock. I remember speeding past a lady who stood like a pillar of salt with both silk-gloved hands to her gawking mouth, and as for gentlemen, how my display of my lower limbs affected them, I can scarcely say, for, let a lady in an evening gown show ever so much bosom, still not an inch of ankle must ever peep from beneath her skirt. But I did not care what I looked like or what anyone thought, for as I sprinted around the corner I spied the street urchin cavorting along not too far ahead of me. "Boy!" I called to him. Pleasantly enough, I thought, and I fully expected him to turn and stop, and we would have a nice little talk and I would give him a penny, but instead he took one look at me over his shoulder, his lacquid eyes widened, and he tore off like a hare before the hounds. The stupid little bounder, whatever was he frightened of? "Boy! Nincompoop! Wait! Come back here!" Without breaking stride, I sped up after him, gaining on him easily, stunted little slum-bred brat. I should have caught him within a moment if he had not made towards Covent Garden and dodged into the streets filled with traffic. Rather than keeping to the pavement, he took to the cobbles, dashing between potato wagons and carts and cabs, and almost under the hooves of coach horses under the hooves of coach horses. Here, being born and weaned in the city, he had great advantage over a country girl who had never been much accustomed to ducking omnibuses. He led me a jolly good chase until I finally lost sight of him entirely. Stopping at a corner where I had last seen him, I stood hot-faced and panting, one hand hauling up my skirt while the other I disciplined my wig, which felt as if it were about to take leave of my head. Confounded thing, no matter how annoying, I should have put it on beforehand and secured it with hairpins. Too out of breath to mutter the naughty phrases that came to mind, I looked about me in every direction with no idea which way to turn. I nearly gave up. Actually, I did give up. With a sigh of exasperation and defeat, I let my skirt, such parts of it as were not already sodden with horse muck, drop at least to decently cover my ankles. Then, ignoring the stares of dressed-to-be-seen Sunday strollers, I applied both hands to the problem of my slipping wig. Trying to restore some order to my appearance, I lifted it to straighten it. "Don't!" screamed a high-pitched voice. Startled, I looked for the source of this terrified plea and discovered the street urchin, the selfsame boy I had been chasing, staring at me, huge-eyed from his hiding-place inside one of the crates, meant for displaying dry goods, flanking the closed door of the corner chandler. Standing where I was, I had unknowingly blocked his escape, but I might never have seen him had he not cried out. "No, please don't!" he wailed. I stood, immobilized by astonishment, with a hand at each side of my wig. "Don't what?" I blurted. I could not imagine what he was so afraid of. He shrieked, "Don't take your hair off! Don't take your nose off either!" "Oh," I said, nodding slowly and wisely, as if he had explained everything. Obviously, the boy was a half-wit and needed to be approached cautiously. Taking care to make no sudden movements as if faced with a cornered animal, I let my wig lapse back onto my head in whatever fashion it so desired. "All right," I added in easy, soothing tones. "No harm done. Would you like a penny?" Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a handful of coins. Hearing the jingling sound and catching sight of the shiny metal, the lad seemed to calm, or at least to shift the focus of his anxiety, as I had thought he might. "I just want to talk with you a moment. Will you come out?" I coaxed. "No!" "Why, then I'll come in, if you don't mind." I simply plopped myself down to sit on the pavement, in front of the crate within which he cowered. Fatigue alone, I think, would not have made me do this, although I was indeed quite fagged from running, but I found the absurdity of the situation irresistible. All around me I heard horrified gasps arise from onlookers, and I sensed how they stepped away as if my extraordinary conduct might spread some sort of contagion. Just 2 years before, during the Queen's Golden Jubilee, a lady had sat down on one of the pathways within the Crystal Palace in order to place a sprig of fir to the top of her boot. Not long afterwards she had been committed to a madhouse. By her husband. Not uncommonly, a woman might be put away in a lunatic asylum for insane conduct such as reading novels, going to spiritualist meetings, quarreling, failure to obey, etc. Having one's wife taken off by body snatchers in a black barouche was a respectable recourse should her presence become erroneous, whereas divorce was a scandal. Whereas divorce was a scandal. It was quite a good thing that I planned to have no husband, I thought, smiling and still panting from running mad. Seated knee to knee with my quarry, as if we were two children playing tea time, I told the filthy little street savage, "How do you do? I'm very pleased to meet you." As if selecting a bonbon, I lifted a penny between my fingers. "I could not help observing you're taking quite a lovely bouquet of flowers to the Watson residence just now." Warily the boy countered, "Don't know no Watson." But his gaze had fixed on the copper coin. "How did you know which number, then?" "The man told me the number." "What man?" "Why, the man who took off his nose." My mind began to feel as fagged as my legs, but I only nodded slowly and sagely once more, deciding to circumvent the nasal impropriety for the time being. "How did you happen to meet the man?" "Or how did you happen to meet this man?" "He called me over." The lad demonstrated a beckoning gesture, as any person of any consequence might use to summon any boy loitering in the street, if the latter was wanted to carry a parcel. Carry a parcel, take a message, hold a horse by the reins, or render any simple service. "Was he in a gig or a dog cart?" I inquired. "No, he were in a right shiny carriage, he were, with horses." Refraining from telling him that a dog cart was also a horse-drawn vehicle, I merely asked, "A phaeton, a brougham?" "Don't know about no broom." "Fine black carriage it were, with yellow spokes to the wheels." A description which could apply to half the vehicles of London. I tried again. "Did you see a coat of arms?" "Sure he had a coat on, and Holmes too. Both Holmes and Anne's. He gave me the posy wit one, and a tuppence wit the other." Losing his fear of me, the lad was becoming more loquacious. A good thing, as I found myself rather at loss trying to question this boy with a head too large for his stunted body and intelligence too small. What did this man look like?" "What like? What's any toff like? Just a long face, tove, and chin whiskers, and a top hat, except that he took his nose off." There it was again. He took his nose off? I strove to keep incredulity out of my tone. Apparently I succeeded, or else the horror of the memory had taken such a hold of the boy he could not help but speak. All in a rush he said, "Knocked it off against the door like when he stuck his head out to give me the flowers. It fell on his lap, and I don't know what scared me worse, that nose lying there, or the way he grabbed it and cursed me and shook at it and told me to take the flowers right smart, or he'd come after me and do the same to me and pull out me eyes into the bargain." Did you see any blood?" "No!" The lad started to tremble. "No more, and if his face was made of wax." "What did he have where his nose should have been?" "Nothing. What I mean, he was just holes, like a skeleton." The boy shivered. "Holes?" But the lad had gone into a convulsive fit of shuddering. "Please don't take your hair off, or your ears, or nothing." "Oh, for goodness sake, why would I? Did the man put his nose back on?" "I don't know, I ran. I just took his flowers just as he said, and then you come chasing me." The street urchin started sobbing, not the usual forthright roar of a young barbarian, but a wail of soul-felt distress. His odd encounter apparently had upset him considerably. "What were you chasing me for?" Never mind. I rose to my feet, aware that each well-bred person passing by gave me a long stare and a wide berth, and handed the child a sixpence instead of a penny, for I felt sorry to have caused him distress. Evidently there was no more sense to be got out of him. Sense! What sense was there in anything I had learned? And that's the end of chapter 8. Yeah, insane to read novels. It's dangerous stuff. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't do Cockney Jersey accents. That... are you sure it wasn't Scottish? Wow, Riddy. Just wow. Chapters total? There's 17 chapters total, and an epilogue. So we're literally halfway through the book at this point. So, it is 7:45 here. I think I'm gonna... Let's see how long this next chapter is. Yeah, I think I'm gonna read one more chapter and then call it. That'll be about a 2-hour stream. And then I think I'm gonna call it there. So, I really appreciate you guys being here. Thanks for hanging in, hanging out. enjoying this. I enjoy having people to actually read to. So thank you guys so much. We'll press on. This will be the last chapter for the night. And then maybe, I'm hoping to stream on Thursday. I think I will be free Thursday evening. I'm maybe I'll try and do this in 2 parts, and I'll read the rest on Thursday night. Thanks. Thanks. I'm glad it's good to be read to. I'm glad I'm not boring, and I hope I'm not reading too fast so you can actually understand me. Alright. Chapter the 9th. Returning at once to my temporary lodgings by the most inconspicuous route, I rang for hot water. While I washed, put on a clean dress, sponged the skirt of the soiled one, and tidied my hair, that is to say, took off my wig, combed it out, and pinned it up in an acceptably attractive fashion, I thought. Or tried to think, but succeeded only in wondering how the man had lost his nose. I vaguely recalled that sometime during the Renaissance there had been a colorful Danish astronomer who had lost his in a duel, but dueling was done with pistols now, not swords, and it was banned in England, although still practiced in the more backwards little countries of the continent. I suppose one could possibly get one's nose shot off by a pistol. The Danish astronomer, I recalled his name now, Tycho Brahe, after his duel had worn a nose made of sterling silver. I wondered why he had not chosen gold, which could hardly have been in worse taste, but I suppose people thought differently about such things before the reign of Queen Victoria. I supposed, now that I thought about it, there were likely a number of men in England whose faces had been similarly altered, if not in duels, then in wars. The Indian Mutiny, the Second Afghan War, that sort of thing. Surely they did not wear silver noses, or chins, or ears, as the case might be. What? There came a timid knock at my chamber door, and my landlady's girl of all work, a wretched wisp of a child who could not have been more than 10 years old, asked, "Will you dine, Miss Everso?" "Yes, I will be down directly." While my current landlady's disposition was in wretched contrast to Mrs. Tupper's, the meals she served were far superior. Meanwhile I sent the girl out for the evening papers, and when I returned to my room after an excellent dinner of roast lamb with mint sauce, I turned up the gas. What luxury to have such ease and effectiveness of lighting, even though the pipes hissed and muttered like a mumbling lunatic. Seated in the least uncomfortable chair, I read all the papers, checking first to see whether there had been any further developments in the Watson case. None were reported, and second, to make sure my personal was included, Hawthorne, convolvulus, asparagus, and poppies, what do you want? Replied this column, MMW. It was. Interesting, I thought, that the sender of the bizarre bouquets, letting alone the matter of his nose for the moment, should be a man. Flowers were generally considered to be in the female domain, although of course there were always a few eccentric amateur scientists, followers of Malthus and Darwin, trying to cross-pollinate orchids and hothouses. Also, upon further reflection, I suppose that any man who had ever courted and or married necessarily learned something of the language of flowers. How fortunate for me that both my brothers were confirmed bachelors, thereby remaining ignorant. Undoubtedly Sherlock, keeping an eye on the personal advertisements, we're in America, for any demand regarding Watson, would notice Hawthorne, convolvulus, asparagus, and poppies, and might be intrigued, possibly even thinking quite mistakenly that it had something to do with Mum and me. I doubted he would guess nearer to the truth. In any event, I hoped for a response of some sort from the Hawthorne man in the morning. Meanwhile, I scanned the newspapers I had been too busy to read this morning and yesterday. There were quite a lot to go through, and no particular reasons to do so except for the discipline of keeping up with the news. But after a while I found myself reading without comprehension, and occasionally one must make allowances. Yawning, I decided that after finishing looking at the agony columns of the Pall Mall Gazette, which I was reading at the moment, I would just go ahead and throw the whole lot into the fire. Just then, I saw it. It's right here. Oh my goodness. Suddenly wide awake with my heart thumping, I reached for paper and pencil. First, I jotted down the alphabet thus. Sorry, it's right there. Then I started on the first word. 4th line, 2nd letter, Q. 2nd line, 5th letter, J. QJ. Realizing my mistake, I started over. 4th letter of the 2nd line, I. 2nd letter of the 5th line, V. 5th letter of the 5th line, Y. Ivy. Yes, it was for me. The gaslight whispering in its pipes now sounded like a ghost in the room. A painful yet incorporeal corset tightened around my chest. I found it difficult to breathe properly as I continued deciphering, but it did not take long to complete the task. Ivy, desire, mistletoe, where, when, love your chrysanthemum. The best and the worst of all possible messages. It seemed I could no longer put off thinking about my mother. I slept very little that night. Indeed, had I not left all of my warm, concealing dark clothing behind at Mrs. Tupper's, I would not have attempted to sleep at all. I would have roamed the city in search of those less fortunate than I, to give them food and shillings, and think less of my own difficulties. Such nighttime questioning was very much a custom of mine, a pox on Viola ever so for keeping me from it. Instead, I needs must lie on a hard and narrow bed while my thoughts refused to be still, chasing around and around like noisy and undisciplined children. Was there no order left in the universe? Mum had never initiated communication with me before, always the other way around. It was just a trick, just like last time Mum, actually my brother Sherlock, had arranged a rendezvous, except that now Sherlock had caught onto the code of flowers, saying mistletoe instead of a meeting. But surely Sherlock would not be wasting any time on me right now, with Dr. Watson missing. Perhaps it really was Mum. If so, my mother must be in some sort of terrible trouble. But wouldn't she name her own time and place if her need to see me were urgent? If someone were setting a trap for me, letting me choose where and when, wasn't that a way to lure me in? Strictly speaking, Mum should not have said mistletoe. That meant a tryst between a gentleman and his paramour. Mum should have said Scarlet Pimpernel. Unless Mum simply thought Scarlet Pimpernel was too much to encrypt. She could have put Pimpernel, a word no longer than mistletoe. But was that not what she would have done? Was the message fake, not from her at all, a trick? But why? And by whom? It was in the Pall Mall Gazette and in no other newspapers. In Mum's favorite publication and no others. It had to be from Mum. I wanted it to be from Mum. I wanted to see Mum? Yes. No, I was angry at her, for good reason. Ivy, desire mistletoe, where, when, love your chrysanthemum. The message said love. Mum had never in her life said such a thing to me. It was a trick. It was what I had always wanted from her. Either the message was a false one, but from whom? Or else my mother had found some affection for me in her heart after all. If I did not respond, I would always wonder, and if I did respond, I would be risking myself and my freedom for the sake of a single fickle word. When one does not know what to do, prudence might decree that one should do nothing, but I cannot bear such inactivity. Hence my penchant to wander the night, and lacking that release at dawn, after a mostly sleepless night, I got up and prepared to go out, even though I had no idea where or for what purpose. I donned my corset, armament, supplies, munitions, petticoats, then a frock sufficiently flounced, frilled, ruffled, and beribboned to promenade city streets, and went on to beautify, in other words, totally disguise my face. All the while my mind continued its interminable, I hate that they break the words up, interminable romping circles. Was the encrypted message truly from my mother? Should I reply to it? What would I say, if and when I did? For the time being, much as I disliked indecision, I would wait. That much I knew, for the only time I had called upon Mum for assistance, she had made me wait, and wait, and wait some more. Indeed, she had not responded at all, and my resentment was such that I felt I ought not see her until I had disciplined my feelings, lest I say something I might later regret. But at the same time, if she had now really and truly reached out to me, and I did not respond, what if she had been ill and had only brief time left to live? What if this was my last chance to make peace with her? Nonsense. If Mum were on her deathbed, she would hardly be asking me to name the time and place for a rendezvous. And so my thoughts ground round and round until, like a mill ox, they had worn their own tired path. I had all but forgotten about the missing Dr. Watson, the forlorn Mrs. Watson, and the sender of the bizarre bouquets, he of the most peculiar removable proboscis. Yet as I glued my little birthmark to my temple, up from some hidden kitchen in the cellar of my mind came elucidation on a silver platter, answering my barely asked question of the day before. What did men with faces disfigured by combat do to ameliorate or conceal the defect? Like a dumbwaiter opening to display a tray of eclairs, common sense served the answer. If one needed it, Why not a false nose or ear, whatever realistically made of flesh-colored rubber, and where would one obtain such a thing? Surely at one of the establishments dealing in face putty, skull caps, and other theatrical paraphernalia, or perhaps even at the store where I had bought my birthmark and my wig. Pertellities, which used to be Chanticleers. Salvation. Needing something to do right now, I would call there. And that is the end of chapter 9. It is not math. Aw, sad. Glad you guys are still here, not missing the book. Thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate it. I am going to be streaming. I'm going to try and stream the rest of this book on Thursday, which is August 16th, probably around the same time, 6 p.m., 7 p.m.-ish, and just go until I finish, hopefully. So if you would like to kind of make a little note and come back then, I will hopefully be finishing it. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good night. I hope you are able to catch up on the rest of this book when you can. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for being here. Feel free to check out my other videos for the rest of this series. And feel free to follow me on Twitch, catch up on me on Twitch. And I will see you guys next time. I'm going to play a little bit of music on the way out, and I'll catch you guys later. Have a good night. Bye.